Founder of the Center for Promotion and Private Enterprise, Dr. Muda Yusuf, has stated that the July 2025 inflation figures presented a mixed outlook for the Nigerian economy with notable improvements in some key indicators, but lingering risks that demand policy attention. According to him, the July 2025 inflation report provides a basis for cautious optimism, arguing that while progress has been made in moderating headline core inflation, the persistence of food and month-on-month inflation price highlights unresolved structural weaknesses. He said the positive trend is that the headline inflation declined for the fourth consecutive month, easing from 22.22% in June to 21.88% in July, a deceleration of 0.34%. Joining us on this show to discuss July inflation and improvements in some key indicators is Muda Yusuf, founder of the Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise. Great to have you, sir. We'll let our colleague in Abuja ask the first question, Vimbai, then we'll come back here to the studio. Vimbai, go ahead quickly.
All right, great. Good morning, sir. It's great to have you on the program today. I'll go straight into it. I was just reviewing a report from PricewaterhouseCoopers that's looking at our economic...
Yeah.
Good morning, sir. All right.
Can you come again,
I was
please?
saying I was just reviewing the economic outlook for 2025 as just released by PricewaterhouseCoopers. And when they unpack the inflation data in that particular report, they say that, yes, as much as there is a huge emphasis on food inflation and energy inflation, the rest of the basket is also facing some heavy pressures. When you look at the cost of housing, the various other costs that are in the basket, all of them are also sitting around that 20% mark. So with this attitude we've taken to use the monetary policy tools, as well as sort of a fight towards reducing food inflation, is that enough to then do a knock-on effect on things like housing and other expenses that households are facing?
Well, first of all, let me say that it is important to acknowledge the deceleration in the inflation, particularly headline inflation, since January to date. I think that is something that we must acknowledge. And for the July inflation number, of course, there's also a deceleration, but the month-on-month inflation increased. But all the other major indicators around food inflation, core inflation, we saw a remarkable deceleration. But the point to make is that I agree with you, even at over 20%, that is still high. I mean, if you look at other parts of the world, particularly the advanced economies, when inflation begins to get to 5-6%, they begin to raise alarm. And here we are talking about 20-21%. So some progress has been made, but a lot more needs to be done, particularly addressing what we call the structural issues. Those things you mentioned, concerning housing, concerning some other, issues or asset acquisition and all of that, those things relate a lot more to structural issues. Structural issues that has to do with things like maybe the fiscal policy that we run presently, things like the taxation, things like the cost of logistics, and things like even insecurity. These are major factors outside the monetary phenomenon. Because what we have seen so far is a very heavy emphasis on the use of monetary policy tools to tackle inflation, which is good. But although it has downside effect, particularly on interest rates and the capacity of businesses to be able to access credit at a rate that is a bit reasonable. But as we have consistently said, and as the CBN has also consistently said, there's a need for this very close and stronger collaboration between the fiscal and monetary regimes or policies. And one important thing which I need to stress here is the trade cost. Because for anything that has to do with production, with infrastructure, I think it is important that we look critically around, the issues of trade, particularly import duty payments. Because these things have a way of also being, cascading down in terms of prices of goods and services. Because whatever we pay at the point of importation, I'm talking of importation of things that are not available here, either raw materials or some critical assets that we need to import. Yes, there may be trade-off in terms of revenue, but I think in managing the economy, we need to balance, some of these objectives. We have revenue objectives. Yes, we need to maximize revenue, but we also have productivity objectives. We also have welfare objectives. So there has to be balance, in our drive to achieve this objective. And we need to use our major policy levers, our fiscal policy, our monetary policy, our tax policy, our trade policy, our investment policy. All of these policies need to work in tandem, in sync, to be able to tackle this problem of inflation, which is a major problem.
Okay. I'd like to ask you, let's drill back to the inflation numbers. When they rebase, they reduce the weighted average of food in inflation baskets. The question is, why was this done? Because the argument we keep hearing is that spending patterns have changed. But when you look at it critically, most homes, the biggest bulk of their spending is still their food costs. So I ask, why was that reduced? The weighted average for food in the inflation baskets.
Well, Rufai, I think that is best posed to the National Bureau of Statistics. Because some of us also, raised this concern at the point when this rebasing was being made. But the argument at that time was that, first, they were using what they call the global best practices in terms of the categorization of those items. So part of what was taken away from food was actually, recognized under restaurants. Because you have a separate heading on restaurants. So that, I think, created an issue. Because I remember engaging even the officials of the NBS at the time. What's the difference between restaurants and food? But according to them, that was the standard metrics in terms of classification. So I agree with you, for most homes, a big part of their budget still go into food. So it is actually very difficult to rationalize or to defend
because,
that position.
with due respect,
what was said at that time.
Because with due respect,
yes,
it now makes the calculation of inflationary numbers suspect. That's what it makes it. Because if you take a major component and you reduce the weighted average, we all know how to skew statistics. Because see, and that's why we're increasingly seeing a phenomenon. Inflation numbers are going down headline, but inflation is not abating in the general market and general public. So there's a mismatch between the data set and what we are seeing. So it's a point for concern.
No, Rufai, I don't quite completely agree with you. First of all, the reduction in weight was just about, I think, 5% or so in terms of the weight that was taken away from the food basket. It was just about 5%. But generally, I think that prices are also moderate. And we also need to make this point. When we talk about inflation coming down, inflation is the rate of increase. When we say there's a reduction in inflation, it doesn't imply a reduction in price. I think we also need to educate the public. Reduction in inflation is reduction in the rate of increase. If, for instance, you had an increase, maybe year on year, 1 year you had an increase of maybe 10 naira, the following year you have an increase of 5 naira, it's still a reduction in inflation, but the price has gone up by additional 5 naira. So the reduction in inflation does not imply a reduction in price. What implies a reduction in price in economics is what we call disinflation. And that is what the citizens are craving for. That is not enough to have a reduction in the rate of increase. We are seeking for a reduction in price itself. That is the point we are making, so and that is what our aspiration and the objectives of policy should be.
The 5% threshold at which they dropped the weighted averages for food is not a small number. It's a number that when you make your final analysis of the calculation, it's a reflective number. And when you drop it that way, you don't see the after effects based on what you are feeling in the market. And that's just it. So, to a large extent, and I think we should have more statisticians in the room to act as a buffer to our National Bureau of Statistics and challenge these numbers.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So it's different what we are saying.
The numbers that we have before us are what we have to work with. Mr. Yusuf, good morning. Just wanted to ask you with regards to some of the...
morning.
You've talked about the fact that we've made some gains, even though we should be cautiously optimistic. What are some of the policy reforms that must happen for us to, to consolidate on the gains that have been recorded, at least with the headline inflations? I know you mentioned around foreign exchange, talked about insecurity, structural reforms you've talked about, but what are some of the things that have held us back, especially with the FX, and also with some of the, that collaboration, if I may put it, between the monetary aspect and the fiscal aspect when it comes to taming inflation?
Well, I earlier alluded to what I call the structural issues. Because in managing the economy, we need to worry about factors that impact on productivity. And those factors include things like the cost of fund, the cost of energy, the cost of logistics, the cost of international trade. I'm talking of issues of ports, clearance of cargo and all of that, and even insecurity. Those are critical factors that impact on productivity. Because if the productivity challenges remain, then we may not be making a lot of headway as far as this inflation numbers is concerned. Because we are dealing now with not just a monetary issue, we are dealing with the challenge of the supply side issue. So if we improve on the supply side, improve the challenges around supply, around production, then we'll be getting somewhere. And some of the things we need to do, for instance, I mentioned the use of policy levers. What we have seen in the tackling of inflation so far has been more of monetary action. We need to see more of fiscal policy action. For instance, for those who are in production, for instance, there is no reason why the import duty on their raw materials, I'm talking of raw materials that are not available locally, there is no reason why it should be more than 5%, especially when you take into account the depreciation in the currency that has taken place. And all these other charges around the importation of raw materials. The same thing with spare parts. The same thing with machineries. These are things that we use for production. Then you come to taxation. You can also use your tax policy instruments to support production. Yes, we are seeing some tax reform now. Some of the components of the tax reform is to incentivize the real sector of the economy. That is good, but we need to see more of that. The same thing with monetary policy. If you are in production and you are borrowing money at 30%, how can you bring down your costs? So the point that needs to be addressed is the supply side problem. If we're able to deal with some of these things, of course, we have issues of logistics. You have issues of energy. You have issues of insecurity. So these are factors that are structural, that are also affecting inflation. So when we talk about addressing some structural reform, these are the issues that we need to address so that you can bring down costs. Look at the cost of vehicles, for instance. A lot of people use, because this is an economy where we depend almost 95% or 98% on road transportation. Vehicle costs should not be as high as it is. Again, I take the point, maybe it's because of FX depreciation. But there's also the import duty and all these charges that are imposed on it. The cost of vehicles now is amazing. And you need vehicles, you need transportation, road transportation, to move things around. Even if we are dealing with high cost of fuel, we should also not be dealing with high cost of vehicles that you need for this transportation. So you need fiscal policy measures around all these areas. And these are things that are within our control.
All right.
So those are the kind of measures I think we should be looking at when we talk about addressing the structural issues and getting fiscal and monetary policies to work in sync.
Very well said. Thank you so much. So always good to have you, Mr. Muda Yusuf, on the show. Thank you for highlighting that. Of course, we'll continue to have the conversations here and look forward to having you back on the morning show.